Have you ever wondered why is it that Jews, Christians, Muslims spend all their time trying to fight about the control for Israel, and specifically Jerusalem? What is so special about that town? Is it because there's a lot of oil? No. Well, stay tuned as we explore the history of Israel from ancient times all the way to the creation of the modern state of Israel in 1948. Whenever people ask me a question about why is it that this happened, as a historian I have a tendency to step back in time 10, 20, 50 or even 100 years to explain what happened before. Well, in the case of why is it that Jerusalem is so important, you have to go back way in the time, not just 1 or 200 years or even 1,000 years, but at least 3,000 years into the ancient times. Why is Israel so important to the Jewish people? Well, it is because this is supposed to be the promised land, capital P, capital L, that was promised to them by Yahweh. Read the Bible, however, you'll notice that the Jewish people barely had control of Israel for most of their ancient history. There's a time around 1000 BC where they were able to set up the kingdom under King David and King Solomon. During that time, they controlled a fairly small kingdom around Israel. And that is also during that time that the first temple of the Jews, the Temple of Solomon, was built. But for most of their history, the Jewish people have one set of tribulations after another, whether they are enslaved in Egypt under the time of Moses, or whether they are during the captivity in Babylon, which is right after the destruction of the first temple. They tended to not have control of the promised land in Israel. Other people, like say the Egyptians or the Hittites or the Assyrians, would control that area. Among those people that would control the kingdom of Israel would be the Romans, that were the big, powerful empire on the block by the time of the 1st century AD. To them, Israel would be referred to as Judea, meaning the land of the Jews. They would have one local king, Herod, that would be kind of their vassal, that would rule the area in the name of the Empire of Rome. The Romans tended to look at Judea as being a problematic province because the Jewish people locally always dreamed of recreating a kingdom of their own that would be independent of Roman control, and that area was known for massive revolts. The largest of these revolts took place in 70 AD, which in retrospect was not the best time to revolt against the Roman Empire because this happened to be smack in the middle of the Pax Romana, that period in the 1st or 2nd century AD where the Roman Empire stood supreme and had defeated all of its enemies. And so after some initial successes, the Jewish rebels were faced with a massive Roman invasion that attacked fortresses at Masada, for example, and the very heart of Jerusalem, and eventually defeated the rebels. And as punishment, pretty much destroyed the entirety of the second Jewish temple, which had been rebuilt under the kingdom of Herod. So if you want to ask yourself, why is it that Jerusalem is so important to Jewish people? Well, because this is the location of the ancient temple of the Jews in ancient times, which since then has not been rebuilt. All you have left would be some retaining walls, which are either referred to as the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall, and that would be the holiest site for the Jewish people. Another major development in Judea during the 1st century AD would be, well, the beginning of the Christian era, meaning that one Jewish rebel, Jesus Christ, began a whole new religion that is named after him. So why is that area of the world so important to Christians? Well, the answer is obvious. This is where Jesus was born, in Bethlehem, grew up, preached in Galilee, and then eventually died during the last week of his life he spent in Jerusalem. And so through the old quarters of Jerusalem would be the Via Dolorosa, where Jesus carried the cross. He was crucified on Mount Golgotha, which is nearby, spent the last night of his life on the Mount of Olives, which is very close as well, and then was buried temporarily in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So all these very, very important aspects for the Christian faith are located right there in the middle of the old town in Jerusalem. In the centuries that followed the destruction of the Second Temple, the Jewish people were kind of cast to the winds. Many of them were killed as punishment by the Romans, but many of them also taken as slaves. And so they got spread out, especially to the western part of the Roman Empire, where would be places like, say, Italy or Algeria or France today. This phenomenon became known as the Diaspora, meaning the Jewish people living in exile. Nowadays, the term diaspora refers to every people living in exile, like, say, the African diaspora, people who are descendants of the Atlantic slave trade. But originally, the term applies specifically to people who are scattered from the Jewish homeland. until they were further spread out in the Middle Ages. Specifically in 1492, the very same year that the Spanish crown finished the Reconquista, was able to push out all the Muslims from Spain, and also commission a voyage to the New World with Christopher Columbus. The King and Queen of Spain also made an order that they would expel all the Jewish people from Spain and eventually Portugal. Those people then spread out quite a bit. Some of them went to Northern Europe, say the Netherlands or North Africa, like Algeria, but quite a few of them also went to the New World because 1492 is when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So you'll find a number of Jewish communities that are known as Sephardic Jews. Sephardic means that they're originally from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. And you'll find them in North America, but also around the Caribbean. In fact, the oldest synagogue that is still in activity would be in Curaçao. It's called the Snoa Synagogue. Beyond that, the Jews who lived in Europe were often subjected to a variety of exactions known as pogroms, which is kind of a lynch mob, to the point where many Jews would then flee from Western Europe and further into the eastern part of Europe, Poland, Russia today. This branch of the Jewish people would be referred to as the Ashkenazi people. There is something strange about the intensity of the hatred against Jews over time. So intense, in fact, that we have had to invent a word to describe it: anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews. What's the root for that? Well, maybe for devout Christians, the fact that when Jesus was crucified, part of the process that led to his execution is some Jewish elders encouraging the Roman governor to crucify Jesus. So there's a stigma there that they are the Jesus killers. But there's more than that. There's also the fact that Jewish people in towns in Middle Ages would often be segregated from the rest, would live in what was called a ghetto, a specific area of Paris or London, where they would be in one specific street. And the fact that the community was so inward-looking with very high rates of intermarriage meant that it was kind of foreign. The fact that people did not know what was going on within the Jewish community also led to a lot of fantasies about what the Jewish faith was actually about. Specifically something called the blood libel, where people were convinced that the Jewish people would practice sacrifice of babies. They don't, but people believed that a lot in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, if you're a devout Catholic, and most people were in Europe, you were not supposed to loan money with interest. Some did, people like the Lombards from Italy, but generally you're not supposed to. So the Jewish people would be overrepresented in the banking profession because they had no personal religious taboo against loaning money with interest. And well, everybody hates their bankers. So all the kind of hatred directed at bankers would then be redirected at the Jews. And that's where you get all that trope of the money-grabbing Shylock that you'll see in, say, a play like The Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare. And that's also the reason why whenever you have a pogrom against the Jews, you often have a spoliation, that their money is taken away. So initially, when the Jewish rebels in 70 AD had been expelled from Judea, they had thought, well, we'll come back fairly soon. And well, that fairly soon turned out to last centuries and eventually millennia. To the point where by the 15th century, it's common for Jewish people at Passover or Yom Kippur to include the phrase, next year in Jerusalem. We've been away from the world, the promised land for centuries, but next year, for sure, we'll be back in Jerusalem. And of course, the following year, they were not back in Jerusalem. And that lasted centuries and eventually millennia. During the Middle Ages, who controls Judea? Well, for a while, the Roman Empire, and then they collapse. Then you have the Byzantine Empire, which is kind of the remnant of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Greek portion. And then by the 600s, 700s, you have emergence of Islam on the world stage. First in the Arabian Peninsula, and then they kind of burst into the Middle East, and that would include Israel, which then became under Muslim occupation. And as it turned out, Jerusalem has a very special place in the heart of the Muslim population as well. It's not as important as some other cities like Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia today, because that's where Muhammad lived. But according to Muslim tradition, Jerusalem is a place where Muhammad ascended into the heavens. And for that reason, that would make it the third holiest city in Islam. And to mark the spot, the Muslims built an important mosque called either the Dome of the Rock or the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which happened to be built pretty much smack on where the old temple of the Jews used to be located. And so if you look at those maps of photos of central Jerusalem, you'll see the Wailing Wall of the Jews, right behind it, the Al-Aqsa Mosque of the Muslims, and in immediate neighborhoods, places like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for the Christians. So that's why the city is so important to all three religions. Another important development was in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, the era of the Crusades, where Christian knights, mostly from France, tried to reconquer the Holy Land from the Muslims. That period was eventually just a blip. The Crusaders were eventually kicked out after a couple hundred years' presence in the area, but also indicates, yet again, how important that area could be for people of Christian descent. A group like, say, the Knights Templars, those famous fighting monks of the Middle Ages, are named after the temple. That's where their headquarters were. For many Jewish people, there was an existential question, which is, where do we belong? Traditionally, we were connected to the temple in Jerusalem, and we were connected to the Promised Land in Israel. But when you've been away from there for 2,000 years, or haven't actually controlled the area fully for 3,000 years, the question becomes, where do I belong? If you're a Jewish person living in, say, the Empire of Austria-Hungary in the middle of Europe in the 19th century, you wonder, am I truly Austrian, Hungarian? My family has been there for generations, or am I still an outsider? One person who tackled that question was Theodor Herzl. He was from Austria-Hungary, lived in the late 19th, early 20th century. And his answer was that as a Jewish person, you really belong in a homeland that would be for Jewish people only. That became known as Zionism, Zion being another term for Jerusalem, that the Jewish people should go back to Israel and have a country of their own. Zionism, however, in the late 19th century, when it really came into being, was more of a pipe dream. The area was firmly in the control of the Ottoman Empire, a Muslim empire, and many Jewish people in Europe or North America, where you have quite a few Jews in the United States by then, were thinking, well, I'm American, I'm French, I'm British. Zionism was by no means an overwhelming kind of ideology at that point. Fast forward a tiny bit to the era of World War I. During that period, the British tried to fight the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, and specifically, a question was, well, who gets to control Israel? And during World War I, the British made many promises through T.E. Lawrence and Gertrude Bell. They told the Arabs of the region that if they allied themselves with the British, then they might get countries of their own after the war. So many Arabs that were of Muslim descent started to dream of having an Arab state in Israel. And meanwhile, the British, through something called the Balfour Declaration, promised to the Jewish people that if they sided with Britain in World War I, well, maybe they could get a homeland of their own after World War I. The promise was a bit vague, but the way a lot of hardcore Zionists took it, it meant we'll get a state in Israel. And at the same time, the British were also negotiating with the French, their allies in World War I, and through a treaty known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, they agreed to divide the Middle East into colonies after World War I if they were successful in defeating the Ottomans. And that would include Israel. So a place like Israel that was controlled by the Turks, by the Muslims, the Ottomans, was at the same time promised to potentially the Arabs or the Muslims, or to the Jews through the Balfour Declaration, and through Christians, in that case the British. So when the dust settled and the Ottoman Empire did lose World War I, and then was dismembered at the Treaty of Sèvres, the British decided that after all they wanted Israel for themselves. And they split parts of the Middle East into what was called mandates, which is pretty much colonies. Some of them went to the French, like say Lebanon or Syria, and quite a few went to the British, and that would include Jordan, Israel, and then Iraq. And throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, that area would be controlled by the British. So we're back into Christian hands back then, and with a strong, active campaign of terrorism and guerrilla warfare and so forth by local Jewish and Muslim settlers who did not want to live under Christian rule. The events of World War II had another impact on the history of Israel. Most importantly and tragically, you have the attempt by the Germans to wipe out the Jewish race from the world, the so-called final solution, or the Shoah, which resulted in the deaths of about 6 million Jews in Europe. So that led to a realization among many Jewish people that lived in Europe, or at least those that survived, that maybe Theodor Herzl was right, that they were not welcome within Europe. And it's not just isolated pogroms and so forth. This is a long-term, deep anti-Semitism that cannot be vanquished. And the only way to be safe as a Jewish person is to have a country of your own, preferably in Israel. So you have a rebirth of the Zionist movement as a result of World War II. The international climate was also good. There's a big wave of sympathy towards the Jewish people in 1945 of doing something to kind of atone for the terrible crimes that were committed against them. So there's a greater willingness to give a state to the Jewish people back there and then. Also important in the international context, after World War II, Britain was so weakened that it started to disband its large colonial empire. Whether it's India in 1947, Kenya in 1963, Ghana in 1957, there's a big wave of decolonization, which we covered in another video. And so Israel itself would become a state of its own? Well, the question is, well, will it become a state that is multi-ethnic, multi-religious, or maybe a state just for the Muslims, or just for the Jews, or maybe two states, one for each? That is a lot of questions, and we will answer those in the next video as we study the history of the State of Israel from its creation in 1948 all the way to the present. And I'll meet you next time in Jerusalem.